There was a body under my bed, and no one believed me. I was 12 when it happened. While taking inventory of my marble collection, my tiger's eye rolled underneath my bed. Without a second thought, I reached under and felt around. That's when my hand touched hers. At 12, the only hands I had ever held were those of my parents when I was little. Not long after I came to, the memory of what triggered the episode came flooding back. I proclaimed that there was a body under my bed. And of course, like the majority would, my parents thought I was full of shit. They said it was just a bad dream, it's just your imagination, but I was adamant and persistent. They had no choice but to investigate. I sat and waited, huddled on the couch. I covered my ears and closed my eyes to prepare for the scream that I knew would come from my mother. When it didn't come, I held my breath and cracked my lids just enough to see my parents standing before me again. Their expressions were less that of concern and more of annoyance. They scolded me for playing such a silly prank, and that was that. My parents were of the no-nonsense variety, especially my dad. Their irritation with the situation made me question if I truly saw what I thought I saw. For the rest of that evening into the night, I avoided my room. Once bedtime came, I wanted to protest, but the look my father gave me spoke louder than words. With shaky legs and shallow breaths, I stepped into my room. Everything looked normal. Felt normal. It even smelled normal. Relief and a healthy dose of exhaustion from the day's events washed over me. I hurriedly changed into my PJs and got snuggled into bed. Sleep came to me easier than expected. However, it was not a restful sleep. Later that morning I awoke, crusty-eyed and groggy from the crying and lack of sleep. Upon entering the kitchen, I greeted my family and my mother replied with her back to me, as she's still cooking breakfast. It wasn't until my father loudly inquired about what the hell happened to my face that I became the focus of attention. My mother made comments about my crusty, puffy eyelids, while Jill lovingly compared my appearance to that of fecal matter, which earned a very stern glance from our father. Without thought, I explained that it was the woman under my bed. Before I could go into further detail, my father briskly cut me off. My father was a harsh man who didn't like to be challenged. Once he had closed the case, there were no appeals. He dealt me some choice words and made it clear that this nonsense prank I was pulling was to end and end immediately. I don't believe any other words were spoken that morning in our entire household. Everyone just quietly played their roles and went about our days. But while I knew better than to utter another word on the subject in the presence of my father, school was a different matter. Joey, my best friend and confidant, believed me without hesitation, and the brainstorming session was on. "She's got to be like some sort of ghost," Joey said, while rubbing his non-existent beard. I had known Joey since kinder, and even at the ripe age of 5, he was a supernatural enthusiast, but I could feel her hand, I replied. He proceeded to explain how not all apparitions are some haunting, ghostly mist. I still didn't understand, but I was willing to accept any explanation more substantial than hallucinations. We, mostly Joey, concluded that she was a lost soul who was stuck on this plane. Why she chose me to appear to, we didn't know. My biggest issues at the time revolved around Pokemon trading cards and video games. I wasn't equipped to help navigate a ghost towards the light, or whatever it was she needed help with. That would not only require mustering the strength to look again, but also finding some kind of way to communicate with her. Should I call a priest or get a Ouija board? Would my parents even allow that? All those thoughts, questions, and more continued to rattle through my brain for the rest of the day. Upon arriving home from school, the silence of our empty house was deafening. I was usually the first one home as both my parents worked until the evening and my sister had cheerleader practice. My usual after-school routine consisted of having a snack while watching TV for about 30 minutes, then straight to homework. It, as well as my daily chores, were expected to be done by the time my parents arrived home, and believe me, Dad was gonna check. But today, I was on a mission. I would have plenty of time for those later. I walked into my room and stood by my bed with all the confidence I could find. I had to figure out what the ghost wanted. I had to help her. After counting down from 10, I dropped to the ground and peered under my bed. In an instant, all the bravado I had moments before was gone. My ghost was still there in the same contorted position, with the same look of shock and sadness, but her skin had started to dull and turn this sickly gray color. In some places, it had begun to sag and droop, giving the impression that it was going to literally fall off the bone, but it was taut and stretched in others, more specifically on her face, which gave her a gaunt skeletal appearance. I didn't know much about death at that age, but I had found enough dead animals in the woods to know that this was a look of decay. It wasn't much longer after this realization that its sickly sweet smell hit my nostrils. I dashed to the bathroom, barely clearing the toilet before my lunch reemerged. By the time my sister got home, I had managed to clean up any remnants of my little episode, but that was about all I had accomplished. She immediately questioned me as to why none of my chores were done. "You know Dad is going to lose his shit," she said. And I knew she was right, but I couldn't even go into my room without gagging. It's like the sight of that decaying specter unlocked the smell. And now it was permeating every inch of my room. After explaining how the situation had worsened, I could see the annoyance all over Jill's face. With an exasperated but gentle tone, she said she was going to prove to me once and for all that this was all in my head. She stood and made a beeline for the closed door. I sprinted in front of her and barricaded the door with my arms spread wide. I begged her to leave it shut. The door was barely keeping the stench at bay. After explaining how the situation had worsened, I could see the annoyance all over Jill's face. With an exasperated but gentle tone, she said she was going to prove to me once and for all that this was all in my head. She stood and made a beeline for the closed door. I sprinted in front of her and barricaded the door with my arms spread wide. I begged her to leave it shut. The door was barely keeping the stench at bay. I didn't understand how she couldn't smell it, as the odor was still slowly seeping through the small gap at the bottom. My sister hesitated, and at that moment I could see her irritation turn to concern. Without another word, she walked away. My parents arrived together sometime after 6. We technically didn't have a family car, so my dad would use his work truck to drop off and pick my mom up on his way to and fro. Occasionally he had far-off jobs, and Mom would catch rides home from a coworker. Those work trips were a blessing to the rest of us, as it meant we would have a few days without tension and chaos. My dad had only been through the door about 30 seconds before his eyes locked onto mine. I swallowed the knot that had formed in my throat the second I heard the car pull into the yard. I tried to get ahead of his anger by word vomiting what was happening and why I had done no chores. I told him about the decaying skin, the horrendous smell, and those ocean blue eyes. In one swift motion, my father grabbed my arm and dragged me to my bedroom door. His mutterings weren't completely audible, but I was able to make out the phrases, "waste of my time," and "idiotic youngin'." These were probably in his top 5 sayings of his lifetime. With a ferocity that we were unfortunate to see on more than one occasion, he swung my door open, nearly ripping it from the hinges. With one hand still gripping my arm, he used the other to lift my bed, frame and all, against the wall. My dad was a naturally large and strong man. Lifting my bed one-handed was easy on a good day, but when he was in a rage, the man probably could move a house. His mutterings weren't completely audible, but I was able to make out the phrases "waste of my time" and "idiotic youngin'." These were probably in his top 5 sayings of his lifetime. With a ferocity that we were unfortunate to see on more than one occasion, he swung my door open, nearly ripping it from the hinges. With one hand still gripping my arm, he used the other to lift my bed, frame and all, against the wall. My dad was a naturally large and strong man. Lifting my bed one-handed was easy on a good day, but when he was in a rage, the man probably could move a house. Amongst the violent disarray of my crying and gagging and my father's yelling, I could still see her through my tear-filled eyes, still lying there in her death pose. How could he not see her, smell her? My father pulled me close to his face. He growled through clenched teeth. "If you keep pulling these fucking pranks, there will be a body under this bed, and it will be yours." The house was quiet, the rest of the evening like it always was, after one of my father's extreme outbursts. No one spoke a word for 2 days the first time he broke a television set. My father wasn't exactly what you would call a loving paternal figure. We never had that traditional all-American father-son relationship. From an early age, he had accepted that I didn't possess that same innate aggression as him, and declared me a lost cause. And though the smell radiating from under my bed was insufferable, I knew better than anyone just how deep my father's rage could go. The thought of that was a whole lot scarier than that of the dead ghost girl under my bed. I got little to no sleep that night. I spent the first couple of hours or so gagging and fighting back the urge to expel what little food I had in my stomach. Once I had acclimated to the putrid smell, It was the quiet sobbing that kept me from sleep. I would cry and cry until I eventually fell asleep, only to be plagued by nightmares of the face that lay below me. I would wake soaked in sweat and tears, only to start the whole process over. And though the smell radiating from under my bed was insufferable, I knew better than anyone just how deep my father's rage could go. The thought of that was a whole lot scarier than that of the dead ghost girl under my bed. I got little to no sleep that night. I spent the first couple of hours or so gagging and fighting back the urge to expel what little food I had in my stomach. Once I had acclimated to the putrid smell, it was the quiet sobbing that kept me from sleep. I would cry and cry until I eventually fell asleep, only to be plagued by nightmares of the face that lay below me. I would wake, soaked in sweat and tears, only to start the whole process over. Unfortunately, this was my new normal, tossing, turning, gagging, and crying all night, followed by complete exhaustion the next day. The lack of sleep was obvious to my family, but no one dared approach the subject, fearing my father's rage. I would occasionally check in on the state of my corpse apparition bunkmate. She continued to disgustingly wither away right before my eyes. I remember thinking I would start to resemble a corpse myself at this rate. And though the sight was gruesome, I had the thought that maybe she would completely decay and dissolve into nothingness. During this time, my nightmares became more vivid. I would see her running in the woods, not jogging, but running in fear. It was like some kind of horror movie. I could feel her fear as she frantically dodged limbs and other forest debris. She would glance back at whoever or whatever she was running from. The look of pure desperation she displayed haunts me more than anything else. The only time I had seen real fear like that before was on TV or in the eyes of my family when my father had one of his more extreme outbursts. It was the fear of knowing something bad was going to happen, and that there was absolutely nothing in this world you could do to stop it. As the nights progressed, so did the dreams. Eventually, her pursuer caught up to her. I will spare you the details of her demise, though it came in the form of a sickening, twisted nightmare. Something told me those scenes were too graphic to not be real, and this woman chose to appear to me. She chose to show me these events. But why? What could I do? I started checking the local news websites to see if anyone who looked like her was missing or murdered, but I found nothing. I had started to think that this predicament would end with me withering and perishing away right along with her. Every day I could see the worry in my mother's eyes, but one sharp glance from my father was enough to make the hardest of men shiver. My mother was a small, meek woman who did what her husband told her, at least to his face. Many nights I was supposed to be deprived of dinner, but she would always manage to sneak me a plate in the wee hours of the morning. She saved me many times in more ways than one. After what felt like years, it all ended on one bright sunny day. I hadn't checked on my specter in a while. By this point, she wasn't much more than a skeleton. The only thing that seemed to resist death's grip was her face. The blue of those eyes never faded. I prepared myself to see that familiar gaze once again, only to find myself looking at a water bottle, a pair of socks, and a baseball mitt. She was gone. I felt a bit of relief, but I felt sadness more than anything. I knew what I had been seeing and experiencing was real. Though I had no proof in those moments, I knew she was real, and I knew what she went through was real, and I hurt for her. No human should go through the atrocities this woman suffered. My family was never religious, but in that moment I prayed that she was at peace. As the day progressed, the immense sadness I felt upon discovering that my specter's departure began to fade. It was replaced with what I can only describe as deep anxiety. I didn't understand why I felt anxious and on edge, especially since it seemed that my ordeal was over. However, shortly after the lunch period, my life, took a turn I never expected. My principal, Mr. Cash, came to retrieve me from my classroom with no disclaimer as to what prompted the trip to his office. I wasn't an angel by any means, but I had managed to never land myself in that hot seat, not even once. During the deafeningly quiet 2-minute walk, I tried to recall anything I could have done to get myself in trouble. It wasn't until he opened the door and I saw the worried face of my sister that I knew the trouble didn't lie with me. Our principal, who was normally a cheerful man, wore an expression that told me no good news was to come from there on out. He informed us that there had been an incident, and our aunt was on her way to pick us up. Jill instantly began to weep. I didn't grasp what was happening. Why weren't our parents coming to get us? Were they hurt? Was Mom hurt? Did my dad hurt her? Mr. Cash stood up and began to walk towards his office door. He paused beside me momentarily and placed his hand on my shoulder. Without another word, he left us to wait. In between my sister's low sobs, I could hear my heart pounding. The thumping seemed to grow louder as each agonizing second ticked on. It then transitioned to a ringing in my ears. As the ringing was about to reach a fever pitch, the door swung open, revealing my aunt. My aunt wouldn't tell us much. She confirmed that, while our parents weren't hurt, there was an incident and my mother, my sister, and I would be staying with her for a bit. This statement unleashed a whole new round of questioning. Despite our persistence, our aunt made it clear that my mother had all the answers. Upon arriving at our aunt's house, we found our mother sitting blank-faced and stoic on the couch. You could tell from the puffiness and redness of her eyes that she had been weeping. She immediately outstretched her arms, and we melted into them. I still didn't know what terrible thing had happened, but I knew I was happy to be in my mother's arms. After our meaningful embrace, my sister and I each took a seat on either side of our mother as she firmly grasped our hands. She solemnly looked from me to my sister before she began. "Your father did a very, very bad thing, and he won't be coming home anytime soon, if ever," she said as her voice began to crack. She proceeded to reveal to us that our father had murdered a woman a state over while he was on one of his supposed work trips. Mother didn't go into much detail to try to spare us some trauma. To prevent us from stumbling upon the gruesome facts of it all, we weren't allowed to watch cable or access the internet. We were told we would be taking the rest of the week off of school, maybe longer. This would normally be a 12-year-old's dream, but this felt more like a hellscape. That night, after everyone else had made peace with the Sandman, I crept into the living room and tuned into the local news station. It wasn't long before I saw her. Plastered on the screen, dressed in her jet black cap and gown, was my ghost girl, Anna Elizabeth Collins. She was 19, not much older than my sister. Anna had fallen in with the wrong crowd shortly after graduating high school. She often caught rides with strangers as a means of getting around. Her body had been found by some hikers out in the woods. Our father and his work truck fit the description of the man seen giving her a ride. Police followed him for weeks waiting for him to slip up. They retrieved DNA from a cigarette he had tossed on the ground. It was a match not just for Anna, but for 2 other unsolved missing persons cases. As I stared into those baby blues, I felt tranquility I had never felt before. Though Anna had suffered greatly at the hands of my father, I somehow knew she was at rest now. I turned off the TV and lay on the couch until I drifted off to sleep. Her body had been found by some hikers out in the woods. Our father and his work truck fit the description of the man seen giving her a ride. Police followed him for weeks waiting for him to slip up. They retrieved DNA from a cigarette he had tossed on the ground. It was a match not just for Anna, but for 2 other unsolved missing persons cases. As I stared into those baby blues, I felt tranquility I had never felt before. Though Anna had suffered greatly at the hands of my father, I somehow knew she was at rest now. I turned off the TV and lay on the couch until I drifted off to sleep. That night there was no gagging, tossing and turning, or nightmares. That night I dreamt I was standing in the middle of my room. Anna appeared in my doorway, but not as the mangled corpse I was used to, but how she looked in the photos and videos on the news. Her face was serene and angelic. She glided across the room as the light of her aura filled the entire space around us. She placed a hand on each of my shoulders and gently pulled me into an embrace. I knew that life was going to be very different for my family and me after this, but in that moment I knew we would eventually be okay. I've never posted on here or told anybody about my story in detail. Sorry if it's a bit jumbled up. I ain't the best storyteller, so from the ages of about 6 up until around 13, I was followed by what I believed to be an evil spirit. Every night I would absolutely tremble at the thought that I had to go to bed. Lived in an old house, probably built early 1920s, with my grandmother and grandfather. Every night I would go to bed, only to wake up to what sounded like someone making yawning and snoring noises in my room, and I would instantly open my eyes and see a grayish figure standing over my bed every night. It would be there. I had bunk beds, but the bed underneath was taken out and a metal cupboard was placed there. It would constantly scratch the drawers all night long and walk about my room, and I would be absolutely terrified to move. I would stay in the same spot for up to 8 hours. My body would literally be in so much pain that I wouldn't move an inch. I used to tell my grandmother about this, but she would assure me it was only a nightmare, and I would put it the back of my head for the day and go to school knowing fully well it was no dream and I would have to deal with it that night. My school life was terrible, as I would only get about 1-3 hours sleep a night. I was so exhausted at school, I was behind in all my work and used to have to stay back to catch up after all the other kids went home. Back at home it started getting more intense and scary, to the point where I literally thought I was gonna die, and what went from walking around my room, scratching my drawers and making noises, turned to fully blown sprinting down my stairs, running into my kitchen, slamming every cupboard door, running back up the stairs, and bursting through my bedroom door and screaming. My grandmother and grandfather never ever woke up once from this. He used to knock my toys over and break things. He used to literally follow me to any house that I'd sleep over at. I remember one time at my auntie's, it started cupboard slamming, then burst into my room and stayed at the bottom of the bed all night, hissing like a snake. One time my wardrobe had moved through the night to try and block my door at least by 10 inches, and like usual in the morning I would get the blame. The worst night I ever experienced was my granddad went to work early. I'd say it was around 4-ish. As soon as he left, I heard the slamming of the cupboard doors, so I knew it was coming. So I prepared myself by lying perfecting flat under the blanket like I would always do. It burst open my door and I have goosebumps as I type this now. I felt a huge weight at the bottom of the bed, so I know something was on the bed and was slowly crawling up to me. I felt like screaming. As a 10-year-old boy, I was terrified. It even terrifies. My now thinking about it, it was like something off a horror. It slowly crawled up the bed and starting scratching in the exact spot where my face was. I could almost feel what seemed to be claws slowing scratching at my face. I didn't know what to do. I remember I had a thought that maybe if I just wrap my arms around it and wrestle it in the blanket, the dash for my grandmother's room to wake her. But I know I was too terrified to move. I thought I was gonna die. This was 100% my worst night. Thankfully it climbed off the bed and ran up and down the stairs a few more times. And that was it for that night. Gradually as I got older, it started getting less and less until the very last encounter I had was kinda weird. I was 13 in high school and hadn't experienced anything for months, possibly even over a year, but I still had a terrible anxiety of going to sleep. I got ready for bed as usual and turned my TV off. There was a blue light on my TV, which reflected onto the wall next to me. I heard a thud at the bottom of my bed and knew something was with me. I can clearly remember as I was now in my teens, I was thinking to myself, I can't let this win this time. It already ruined my childhood. I can't let it win. I was looking at the blue reflection on my wall to see if I could see anything. I see this huge black shadow come over me, just look at me for about 5 minutes and leave. I say this was my weirdest experience because I felt no threat this time and didn't feel like anything wanted to hurt me, like the last few years. Could this have been a spirit looking over me? I don't know, but I do know that was my last experience with whatever it was, and I'm 21 now. My grandparents still live in the house, but I have moved on. If anyone could help me in any way, I'd appreciate. I sometimes wonder what crawled up my bed that night and what would have happened if I tried to confront it. It's been years now, and I really want answers. Thanks for reading. I have always been afraid of the monsters under my bed. I would imagine how it would look, with its fangs and blood-red eyes, or a slimy glob of glowing light, or a hand that will pull your foot if you do not make it safe on the bed fast enough. My bed is the only safe place in this room. I never look under my bed. I call Mom and Dad whenever I get scared, and they would look under for me. They never get tired of tucking me in and kissing my forehead after reassuring me that there is no monster under my bed every night. I don't want to be a burden to them though. That's why I always love sleepovers. It's far less scarier to sleep with someone beside you. I've been invited to one by my classmate tonight. She's always been quiet, and I seem to be the only one she's comfortable to talk to. I guess we both love the same kinds of songs that girls our age don't usually listen to. I've got my overnight bag ready in the car, and I put on my yellow sweater and cute fluffy slippers. Gail, I hear my mom calling for me downstairs. It's time to go, honey. I walked down the stairs and took my mother's hand as we both walked to the car. Are you excited? My mom teased. I am, actually. I replied, checking my backpack again to make sure I have everything ready. Me and Abby will have a great night, I bet. Moments later, we arrived at a beautiful beige house. We are greeted by Abby's mother at the door, and she called Abby to come down. Abby's mother looks stressed, but still beautiful. I see where Abby got her golden locks and big blue eyes. Abby must have gotten her nose and lips from her father, though, because her moms were not that good. Abby suddenly appeared and grabbed my hand as she pulled me inside the house. Bye, Mom. Bye, sweetie, I hear my mom say as she slowly disappeared from my vision. Abby and I went to their garden near the pool where we sang our favorite song while she played her ukulele. I never knew she was good at playing it, and when I asked her if clipping the strings hurt, she just told me that it is far from painful. We then exchanged gossips that we know of and made fun of our teachers. Our conversation was interrupted by the smell of good food, and our stomachs both growled. We hurriedly made our way to the dining room, where food is being prepared by her dad. He was wearing a sexy chef apron and had a dark black hair and thick beard. I say my hellos and sat beside Abby on the table. Her mom then went out of a room that I think is her office and immediately helped in setting the table. Jeffrey, Abby's mom called, looking up. Abby, will you please call your brother to come down already? Her dad requested. Abby's smile slowly fades as she shakes a little. I think she's tired. I'll go with you, I tell Abby. No need to get me, a deep voice coming from the stairs said. I'm coming. Abby's older brother is actually good looking. One of the boys that you might have a crush on at school. Smells good, Dad, her brother said. And who is this cutie, Abby? I giggled. I've always been called cute, but by a boy as handsome as him, I can't help but get excited. The food was great, and we were laughing at Abby's dad and Jeffrey's jokes. They were both funny as they spit out one joke after another. I can tell that Abby was uneasy, though. Maybe it's just because she's not used to having people other than her family at dinners. We watched an episode of my favorite show after dinner, then climbed to bed a while after. Abby and I lied down on her bed, facing each other, her blanket covering us. I had fun today, I said as I smiled at her. Me too, she replied. Thank you for coming here tonight. I really hate it here sometimes. Why? It just feels like I'm never safe. I can understand that. I tried to comfort her. I've always been afraid of the monsters under my bed. I really think they're real. It's not like that, she said. The house is quiet now, and I was on the verge of falling asleep when Abby shook my shoulder. Gil, you have to go under the bed, she whispered. I am so sorry, I didn't think. We see the doorknob of her room turning, and she pushed me off the bed. I did what she told me even when I am still scared. I guess I can do this for her. Abby? A familiar voice calls out. Where's your little friend? I shudder. Not now, please, she said. The sound of her voice is in tears. Please stop. Get out. Oh well, no worries, the voice replies. I've always loved my little Abby more than anyone else anyway. The voice is teasing, and I can see it climb up the bed. I can hear Abby's shouts getting muffled. There were groans, and I am scared for Abby. I can hear her crying now. I can feel the bed shaking too. I climbed out of the bed and saw Abby's brother on top of her. Abby's pajamas had been pulled off, and her face were wet with tears. I have never been more afraid of anything than the monster showing itself on her bed. I wasn't scared of how it looked before, but I am scared of how familiar its face is. I never thought that under the bed would ever be a safe place for me.